One of the archaeology of the landscape classes was to look at the monastic Grange. Like most of the classes I've been teaching in the series to my students very recently, the topics have turned out to be more challenging than I thought, in that trying to make the areas of archaeology interesting. And research has been not the easiest to come by. The internet has been not the best area to look at, but my publications that I do hold. Let's move on. The archaeology of the monastic Grange. Why am I showing an image of a medieval coal mining landscape that was being discovered via open cast? One reason is that the monastic Grange itself would have been requiring a source of income out of coal mining activities that were undertaken by the church. It was only those skilled individuals that were in monastic life that had come over from France that were able to mine. That links us in with the monastic community within the Grange. When we think about the monastic Grange, we need to be taken and disinherited from this image here in front of us, showing a standard monastic landscape at Baynard Abbey. This would show the great church, nave, the chancel, basically the cloistered area, all the apartments associated with monastic life. Other than the large church, most of this continued over to the monastic Grange. This monastic Grange in front of us is one of many that survives deserted across the landscape. Throughout my research about the monastic way of life and the likes of Henry VIII and the dissolution, I've started to come to this startling realization that this monastic life became very disparate in its later years and become very fat of the unfortunate beings that were the vulgaris that surrounded these monastic Grange landscapes. Let's look at this. This is a plan of the monastic Grange at Mount Nash. The remains are some of the best surviving in Wales in this aerial photograph. Let's look at a little bit of a description of this from the Royal Commission on Ancient Historical Monuments. This monastic Grange, in the heart of the Vale of Glamorgan, the best agricultural land, Grange came into existence in the early years of the Abbey of Neath. This land was granted to it in perpetuity by Richard de Granville, somewhere around 1129-1130. And this was basically Richard de Granville's passport to heaven. He granted hundreds of acres to the monastic Grange, and this would give him access to the right-hand side of the very Jesus Christ he wished to head to within his death. Basic features of this landscape are a quadrangular enclosure, some 320 metres in length. There is another monastic Grange nearby at Mare Cross. This monastic Grange, at its width, was up to 262 metres. This enclosed an area of around 20 acres, surrounded by the best agricultural land within the Vale of Glamorgan. Little to no archaeological excavation activity has been associated with this site, and the information is yet to be really published in any decent form. The ditch around the site south is still about 1 metre deep. It has a wonderful dovecote. It also has access to the longest tide barn in the area, over 200 feet in length by 30 feet in length. And it's the most impressive piece of the landscape that can be seen for miles around. This site probably fell into the dissolution book sometime in the 1530s, and it was probably sometime by the 1540s it started to be transferred into a farm. It's a farming landscape today for sheep and for cattle. It occupies some of the best agricultural land in the region. Now, what can be said about these monastic granges, and a little bit more about these monastic granges? Let's go into another slide. This is the monastic grange reconstruction of the monastic grange to be found at Barrow-in-Furness. Barrow originally started off as a monastic grange, or otherwise known as Barrai. Barrow itself was a monastic grange of the Cistercian monks, the Ordo Cistercia, which are also the same order associated with Monk Nash. These Cumbrian monks, linked to Furness Abbey, start to see the first mention of the monastic grange sometime in about 1190, but it had already been there. The Cistercians were the first in the country to establish monastic granges. The monastic grange itself gave life to modern day Barrow-in-Furness. It would have had all the fish ponds and mills, but very little can be seen or situated within the archaeology, except in the location of a certain William Fisher's farm in the 1800s. This landscape itself was a landscape that very much kept itself uniquely apart from the vulgaris, the common people. But the very late and well-respected Professor Mike Aston, within his beloved Somerset, believes that the monastic grange was within the landscape, particularly in Somerset, where there was some intermixing. Some say the intermixing was to gauge an idea of the taxes that could be extracted from the native people. So having your monastic agriculture alongside the vulgaris agriculture, you know exactly how much to tax from what your yield is, but that's another story. Usually monastic granges themselves were not in the landscape. They were kept solely separate, and this was to make sure that the order kept to itself. The Grange itself, a little bit more information on the Grange and these monastic granges, that they really developed into farms after the dissolution of the monastery. I don't think any monastic granges really survived the dissolution of the monasteries, particularly in Wales, England, maybe one or two in Ireland, maybe one or two in Scotland, other remote islands, difficult to say. Grange buildings themselves were basic, you could say. Dormitories, the tithe barn, the dovecote, which is essential, the chapel, storage buildings, other areas for prayer. Maybe there would have been rest houses as well. Maybe there would have been almshouses for the poor, all part of this rich tapestry of the monastic grange. Various things can be said. Even though the monastic grange can be seen to be very disinherited, i.e. from this image of Furness Abbey, the one thing that can be said is about the tithe barn. The one at Magnash, for example, in the Vale of Glamorgan, with its over nearly 70 metres in length by just around 10 metres in width, had two massive porches entering into the site and one exit porch. One big feature was to extract as much as you can, not only from your own estate, but the vulgaris that surrounded your land, and to parcel this up, to bag it all up and send it to the Neath Abbey itself. Moving a little bit further, there was an archaeological excavation at a site in Wales, again known as KARL-JAMES, at Swith Funham in Ceredigion. We don't have any suitable images to show you, but we've got a bit of geophys that can be found on the internet of KARL-JAMES. It was excavated in 2010 with funding from CADU, involvement of David Archaeological Trust and Lampeter University. The example at KARL-JAMES showed that very little of the monastic grange now survived. It had been mucked around with, lots of the stone had been taken away elsewhere. Bits of later pottery, Bronze Age evidence in the landscape, continuity, lots of Victorian stuff, but they really struggled with the site. Whereas likely that the stonework was taken away, like much stonework, was taken away from lots of monastic granges across our learned landscape. It's said again, if those watchers from elsewhere watching this video, got to mention Leicester, the monastic granges of Leicester were important to all different counties of our landscape, particularly to the likes of Leicester. May I quote from Paul Courtney, the monastic granges of Leicestershire. He says that purely economic formation, external to the administration and social life of the district, could be seen with monastic grange. To produce all that a Cistercian monastery may need, and later on the Dominicans, later on the Benedictines, the Franciscans, and so on. It can be said that the monastic grange itself wasn't being to be seen just on an agricultural basis to plough the landscape, could be seen to animal husbandry. Large flocks of sheep, cattle were kept, particularly later on into the early 1500s. These granges themselves owed their existence to grants, mainly from very rich patrons who wished an access key into heaven, and for them to be ever alongside the great man up in the sky. Lots of monastic granges do have historical references later on, but one or two were completely missed from the history books. One such example found in the Somerset landscape. Moving on with these monastic granges, if you look again at my images, we look at a very big gash in the landscape. This is a monastic grange that was discovered very recently, last year I believe, via aerial photography at Shap in Cumbria. You can see the buildings there. That great gash there is to do with mining in the area. This monastic grange that you can see in front of you is one that was excavated in Somerset by complete accident. And you can see bits of walls, and this is likely to have disappeared well before the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, sometime in the mid-1300s, about 1350, which would culminate with the Great Plague disaster that in Wales was responsible for the deaths of between 80 and 90% of the population, in England more like 70% of the population, and similarly in Scotland. And this monastic grange that you can see in front of us was not written about, and found not so long ago in Somerset is now being developed upon. Monastic grange to show off. This would be a typical entranceway into a tithe band, that great tithe band. Again, I'll quote the one at Monknash near us had two great porches. This is one, but you can imagine these great doors, having to bring your corn to this site, being overawed but being intimidated. Going back to the images, there was archaeological excavations at a place known as Muggleswick. And when archaeologists excavated at Muggleswick, they were part of the Altogether Archaeology organisation. And the archaeology at Muggleswick is quoted, "Spectacular ruins of Muggleswick Grange was found." Muggleswick is first recorded in 1183, probably belonging to the Prior of Durham. It was in the heart, not of just a few hundred acres, say as we see at Monknash, which was a few hundred acres of the best land in Wales, but in this locality was in the heart of 1,200 acres, not just agriculturally ploughing, producing barley and wheat, but this was to produce meat, sheep, deer, cattle, pig maybe, hides and timber as well. These monastic granges are to be seen as producing everything that a monastery would require. Not only supplies of grain, not only supplies of meat, not only supplies of, for example, the basic produces that they required. But timber was needed for the upkeep of the varying large cathedrals and abbeys. Stone was required. So if you had land, a grange, you wouldn't have to buy the stone off anyone. You could just quarry it on your landscape. And this was ideal because the monks of the day were skilled. They'd come over from Europe. They had those skills, a bit like a Roman soldier had been 1,000 years earlier who had an extra skill other than fighting. They had the skills. They were able to not only plough the landscape, but were able to quarry. They were able to quarry coal. They were able to quarry stone. They were able to cut wood. They were carpenters, and so on and so on. Even lots of them had their own potteries. They had their own mills. This was not only associated with the abbeys and the cathedrals, but the granges themselves. We even see, for example, at Muggleswick, that we find window glass. They had decorated windows. What they found at Muggleswick was the remains of a very proud chapel that was associated with the monastic Grange that 50 or 100 of the monks would have visited on a regular basis for their varying prayeral activities. Coming to the very end of this session today, when we looked at monastic granges, we've looked at lots of humps and bumps in the ground, but lots of the archaeology does survive above ground today as well, hidden within the fabric of later farm buildings, as we can clearly see in this image from a Grange farm. One thing I'd like to close on is that I have made something of the fact that monastic granges were about more than just agriculture. An example of Stanley Monastic Grange, which you can see in Derby, near a place called Erewash, protected by the likes of English heritage. That site itself, associated with the river, associated with Dale Abbey, was very much into mining activities, iron ore mining activities, and that's a very important aspect. And another area that you could say with the likes of English heritage have a really interesting description of what a monastic grange is. So if we finish on this, I think this will be very useful for everybody as well. English heritage would say a monastic grange was a farm owned and run by a monastic community and independent of the secular manorial system of communal agriculture and servile labour. The function of granges was to provide food and raw materials for consumption within the parent monastic house itself, and also to provide surpluses for sale for profit. As Henry VIII realised, the monastic granges were very fat and wealthy at their very latter ends, where it was an honour, this is me now rather than English heritage, where it was a real honour to send your second son to be a monk or your first daughter to be a nun. And it was a great honour to serve for the church. Later on in about the 1500s, it would have been people in society were on the edge, people in society that wished to escape, and the second sons were now part of the overall running of their father's their father's landscapes, because people were a lot more freer in the 1500s. Before, they were a bit more closed. The first monastic granges came over really with the Normans. There were some establishments before that, but the idea came over. It was pioneered by the Cistercian order and imitated by the other orders. They were lay brothers, the oxen of Christ, and a very much mixed economy, as we've already said. The burkeries, the sheep farms, the vaqueries, the cattle ranches, the horse studs, various industrial complexes, very wealthy houses, very rich off the land. And later on, in the early part of the 1500s, land that was the monastic grange land, because there was a fall in the monks, would be rented out to various farmers. And eventually those farmers would seize the land when it came to the period of Henry VIII. This is KARL-JAMES Langford. Hopefully you've enjoyed this expose of my landscape series looking at monastic granges. Thank you very much. Any comments? Anyone wishing to join or subscribe to my series of lectures would be great. This is for Archaeology Cymru. Archaeology Cymru can be visited for all our activities on www.archaeologycymru.ghosts.weebly.com. Link coming up.